Thanks to everyone who's joining us live, or if you're listening to this, after the fact, if you have more time to do it, welcome to this session. So we're continuing on in this conversation about brands doing good and examining sustainability and maybe some elements related to ESG. I know there's already a ton of conversation that's transpired, so we're going to switch into a little bit of a different zone of ESG. I know it stands for environment, social, and governance. So we're really going to zone in on the social part of the conversation today. So I know our panelists have already been introduced. Jonathan, Chris, Jason, just welcome you all and thank you guys for joining for this conversation.
Yeah, happy to be here. Quick correction, I think SiriusXM was mentioned, but now I'm over at Chime as the new Senior Director of Marketing, Data, and Technology. Also, I'm using an Apple for the first time in my career as my main computer. So instead of a fun background, we're going to have this nice green screen behind me because Zoom is not working with me today. So
that's so funny. I thought, Jonathan, that you did it deliberately because it was green for Chime.
Oh yeah, that's exactly why I did that.
Excellent. Well, with that, I think we can go ahead and jump into this conversation. I think the time's going to end up really flying by. So I want to start off the conversation asking you all something about just being involved in the social aspect of ESG. I think, except for, I would say maybe Jason, there might be a clear indicator of what his involvement is because he is a diversity, equity, and inclusion leader. Really want to make sure we're painting a picture of how you all have decided to commit yourselves and have that interest in the conversation today. So we could go ahead and kick it off with you, Jonathan, if you want to give us some background on what brought you to this conversation and why you have energy here.
Sure. So I think outside of our day-to-day jobs and organizations, it's tremendously important, especially as leaders, to participate in things that maybe aren't listed as your, again, day-to-day responsibilities, but benefit the entirety of the organization, the people that you are working with alongside, whether directly or indirectly, and then the general population, kind of investing time and effort into making the world a little bit of a better place while using your organization as that kind of medium to help you kind of achieve more than you can do on your own. So I always make it a part of my experience at any organization to get involved with the ERGs to figure out, what they're doing from a humanitarian effort, from a donation and a causation effort, and try to, sometimes it can be stressful, especially if like the workload and the day is busy, but I think it's tremendously valuable and important. And I encourage everybody on my team to kind of do that same thing and participate in that way at the companies.
I love that. And I love you encouraging others to also join in and gain the benefit of not just fulfilling, what you can gain from being a part of those conversations and affecting that change, but encouraging others to do the same. So we'll go from Jonathan to let's go to Chris. Chris, tell us a little bit about your experiences being involved in the social aspect of ESG.
Sure. Yeah, I agree with everything Jonathan said as well, with the importance of ERG work within the organization. I've always made it a point to make sure myself, I am openly participating in a lot of these ERGs and promoting them within my own team as well. And yeah, I think it fosters the type of environment that I personally want to work in. And I hope that it also produces an environment that other people will see within the organization and want to work here as well, because those are the types of people that I want to work with.
Fostering the right environment. I love that. So important. And every employee can play a role in making that happen. So I appreciate those points, Christopher. And we'll cut to Jason. Jason, if you want to share a little bit, especially since it extends not past your work, but it's the core of your work. If you can tell us a little bit about your involvement.
Yeah, it really is the core of my work. But I think similar to what both Chris and Jonathan have said, the ERG and that type of work was really kind of the gateway drug. I wasn't always the director of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think really what got me involved in this work was my desire to for all the companies that I work for to leave them better than I found them, and to really give voice to people who felt like they didn't have a voice within the company, and direct change, both internally and externally in a company. So having things like employee resource groups were such an excellent way of giving voice to the employees. Of you have all this resource here of employees who want to help the company do better, both the way products are marketed or the way we hire, all of those, and everything in between. And that's what really got me involved in this work. And then I realized that it was really the passion of my life. And I switched from marketing, which was my original career, for 15 years, and realized that diversity, equity, inclusion was actually a much more important thing for me to do. And I made that transition into doing it full time.
I think a couple folks out there, more than a couple, have had that exposure to the gateway drug of ERGs and have made that transition, especially I would say in the last 2 years, which leads me to pivot to my next question, which is at least first directed at you, Jason, but of course I'd love Christopher and Jonathan to join in on it as well if they have energy here. As a longtime leader from a DEI perspective, and having an expanded interest in DEI predating your current roles, how have you experienced brands really stepping up the type of work that they're doing to prioritize diversity?
Yeah, I think, Noor, you hit on a big point, in particular the last couple of years, with the kind of sea change that has happened with Black Lives Matter and George Floyd and all the others, and anti-Asian American violence. And I think it's really forced companies who otherwise were kind of reticent to make public statements or to take public stances. It's kind of forced them to get out of that reticence and actually take a stand because their employees have demanded it. And I think that's employees and customers have demanded it, that they were taking their dollars to companies that were making stands. And I think in the past, companies that I work for were also very hesitant to make public statements. But once again, ERGs were really great at applying the pressure to saying, this is important to your employees that we talk about these things both internally and externally. And talk about, we had, in a past company, we had an all hands meeting just specifically to talk about George Floyd and Black Lives Matter. And it was a really cathartic, and this was shortly after it happened. And it was an open forum where all employees could come, they could ask questions, they could talk about this. And it was really important to have that outlet for people to, particularly to ask questions for those who maybe didn't really understand what Black Lives Matter was, or didn't understand why people got upset if you said things like all lives matter instead of Black Lives Matter, and being able to in a safe zone talk about those things and explain to people who otherwise maybe didn't really understand, to give them the feedback from people who are heavily involved in it, was an incredible opportunity to build some bridges and to educate some people on things that they were maybe unclear of or had negative impressions about, but maybe hearing it from other people helped them to center and understand a little bit better.
It's taking me back. I think now it's been almost 2 years and it still feels like it happened recently. A part of it feels like it was a long time ago. It feels like a lot of time has passed. It's unexplainable how important these shifts have been. And it's unfortunate that it took so much pain and distress to get us to a place where corporations are open to enabling this level of engagement. So I know these observations are ones that can be made by employees, whether or not they necessarily are functioning in official DEI capacity. I don't know, Jonathan or Chris, if you had anything additive that you wanted to build on top of what Jason shared.
Yeah, I think some of the greatest moments, I think, coming from some of the company outreach programs or presentations or time that was made by organizations to talk about some of these really difficult and terrible issues, has been the education component. So Jason, what you had mentioned, like some people not knowing what these terms mean or why certain things are upsetting, or just they were too afraid to ask on their own, but these events provide them that opportunity and that window to reach out to somebody. and actively engage and learn more about their ERGs, where they can go and be a supporter or an ally, even if they don't fit in that specific demographic that the group was created for, and really learn and become a better person. So I think I've seen some amazing examples at organizations where, some amazing conversations were started from that. And then on the pride side, which is typically where I have my focus in organizations as well. So like kind of the part of the organization or the ERG that supports the LGBTQ plus members of the group. I've had people reach out to me and ask about, pronouns and just like why certain questions about their own children that, they were hoping to get a little bit more insight or understanding on. So tremendously rewarding for sure.
And yeah, Chris, if you wanted to jump in with any additional thoughts.
Yeah, I agree with everything being said with the importance of the ERG work, bringing in, not just the specific community that the ERG represents, but also the intersectionality with the other ERGs and with the company as a whole, and providing those safe spaces to talk about issues particular to one community. But being able to outreach to the rest of the company and be able to speak through those issues. Yeah,
I love that. I think that's super important too, as a person who's also heavily involved with a series of different ERGs at Basis Technologies. I think that intersectionality piece where that there's a desire to develop allyship and then also create safe spaces for people who share common identity traits. There's a very informed experience that transpires when you try to meld these groups together, and in addition to bringing allies into the groups as well. So really appreciate the point there, Chris. So we'll expand from there into getting a little bit more information on what some of these additional programs are connected to DE&I that we're seeing at organizations. So I'll leave it open-ended and we'll just see who has like the yellow box first. In my mind, maybe Jason has a very informed thought here because he leads DEI programming, but Chris and Jonathan and even myself, like we're all experiencing DEI programming, seeing it coming down for a period of time now. So I'm just curious, what are some of the key initiatives that are being extended to employees to enable the embrace of DEI? I'll leave that open for whoever again.
I'll jump in there. It's literally what I'm doing right now. As I'm relatively new with the company I'm at now, and one of the main reasons I was hired to take this job was to create the DEI strategy for the company, because this is a new path that they're on, to really have a concerted effort to create a more inclusive and a sense of belonging and diverse environment throughout the company, and they're very strongly committed to it. And really some of the key things, as I'm rolling out the strategy, was really understanding where are we now, where's the company at now. So I think before you can start coming up with solutions or problem solving, you really need to understand how the employees feel about diversity, equity, inclusion, what do they understand about it, because there's a lot of misconceptions about when you say the term diversity or when you say equity and inclusion. Even understanding what those mean can be problematic because people have negative opinions. Sometimes when you say the word diversity with regards to recruiting and hiring and promotions and things like that, people think diversity means lowering standards, or diversity means quotas and things like that. So dispelling misconceptions it becomes a really early part of things, is having those conversations so that people don't think that having a more diverse focus on how you're writing job descriptions or how you're doing promotions or where you're going to hire people is somehow taking away from existing groups. And so the education is a big piece in the beginning, and then once you've at least gotten on some foundation where everybody kind of understands the basic diversity principles, then you can start building on it and really tackling bigger issues like intersectionality and bigger issues like anti-racism and homophobia and just microaggressions and all the things that you need to tackle in order to move an organization forward. You need to have that foundation first. or else it's not going to work. If you're trying to start, you can't run a marathon if you haven't done any training first. And I think that's what a lot of companies, why they fail at this, is because they try to jump in and immediately start creating programs. It's like, no, you have to take a step back and make sure you're meeting people where they are, and starting from there, which is what I've spent the last almost 3 months, is trying to meet everyone here where they are.
Fair points there. Chris, did you have something you wanted to jump in with?
Yeah, I wanted to echo the education piece of what Jason is saying. I think one thing I noticed at EA was the company published a report last year on the gender and racial makeup of the company, at least for the US. And I believe it's the first time I've been at a company that's done this. I'm not sure if this is, out of the norm, but the report doesn't just show overall numbers of the breakdown of the different groups, but it shows it alongside that same breakdown within leaders and technical roles. And so anyone can look at this report, and the problem is obvious. You can look at it and see the gap. And I think that is one important piece for educating the company as to what these issues are. And it's the first step in recognizing it, and being able to see it right there. The data is right there. And yeah, I think it was something unique that I've seen, and I think it helps drive the correct conversations.
Yeah, super important. I've seen more and more of those reports, and it really is a good accountability piece too, right? For the organizations to say, we're going to take the time to create this reporting. We're going to take a look in the mirror, and now we're going to disclose it, because I think sometimes actually organizations, they do the math in the background, but they don't necessarily always feel comfortable extending it to their company. And definitely they don't always feel comfortable extending it publicly, but more and more organizations are doing it. And I think it's because they're looking for that accountability and to just move everything forward. So I love that. I love that point too. I think for the sake of time, because the time is just flying by actually quite quickly as you all are bringing up really good points, I'll move us into another question that's specifically focused around recruitment. And I know, a lot of very good points have already been made, Jason, as it relates to recruitment and diversity, but there are these sometimes negative sentiments that people attach to diversity hires. And people have started using it sometimes with that tone. So I'm curious from your perspective, as far as brands really pushing forward to enable that diverse hiring to occur, so that we can bring in those that more diverse array of employees and demographics. What are the steps that employers need to take and brands need to take? Because I think if to make a call back again to 2 years ago, a lot of organizations were saying, well, where are they? Can't find them. It's too hard. So Jason, what do you have to say to that?
Yeah, that's a common people throw their hands up. Oh, we've tried to look to increase diversity, and we never get any applications, or they're not qualified for the roles. And my question to that is always, where are you looking? And for me, it's all about the relationships that you're building on the recruiting side. Are you building relationships with organizations like Afrotech and Tech Korea and women in tech organizations to go out and actively look for it, which historically about colleges and historically that and serving colleges? Are you building those relationships so that you're finding diverse candidates from all sorts of places? And if you're not doing that, then that's why you're not finding people. If you're just looking in the same 3 universities that you always hire from, or from the same 5 companies that you always poach people from, you're going to end up with the same people over and over again. But if you expand your talent pool, then you'll bring in talent. It's always still about finding the most qualified candidates, but you need to be looking for them in as many different places as possible. And the other side of that also is you can bring in diverse candidates, but if your organization hasn't done the work to be a welcoming and inclusive place, you may get people to join the company, but they're not going to stay. They're going to attrit out because they don't feel welcome. So you need to have done that work so that the entire process, from the first moment they see a job posting that job posting is written in a way that isn't exclusive. It isn't excluding people that haven't gone to an Ivy League university, or it isn't excluding women, because all these studies that show women will only apply for a job where they feel like they check off every single box from the job description. So if you're including things that aren't really necessary for the job, you're already excluding 50% of the population, because the women won't apply for the job. And so all those things, doing all that work, doing things in your marketing for jobs, that you're showing what a welcoming environment is, that you're highlighting the ERGs that exist in your company so that people want to work for your company. And all of those things are, if you put all those things in place, you will find more diverse candidates, and your company will naturally become a more diverse place. But you have to do the work to do it. You can't just do a token effort and then say, oh, we couldn't find anybody.
I want to position the question right back to you, Jason, but then I also want to position the question to Jonathan and Chris. I think there's something interesting about our panelists, because you all three work for very, I would say, companies that are in different stages of their own trajectory. You work in different industries, but to point it back towards you first, Jason, you work in an industry where there is this proclivity to hire from maybe the Ivy Leagues, or people who have a very specific STEM-oriented background, and there are these like rigid ways in which hiring takes place that are not so easy to abandon. I work in advertising. It's a little bit different in terms of sometimes the openness or flexibility to let people use transferable skills. Can't exactly use transferable skills all the time in an industry like yours. So maybe you can just give some expanded, paint a little bit of an expanded picture on how you've been trying to overcome those hurdles in the genomic space, which
so in this space, we have a lot of PhDs, a lot of doctors, a lot of scientists that work here, and I think it's important that, once again, there are PhD programs in chemistry and science and oncology and all the things that we're looking for in a variety of schools. So it's me pushing and our whole kind of HR and recruiting team pushing the boundaries of where we're looking, so that we're once again going to historically Black colleges and historically Latin serving colleges, and making efforts to find people, and even going earlier to having internship programs for students in the Oakland school district, and looking for high school kids to get them involved earlier that may have an interest in science, but maybe they were afraid to make that jump because they didn't see anybody that looked like them in that role. They couldn't imagine themselves in those roles. So getting those people early and bringing them in and exposing them to the labs and all the exciting things that the company does to get them involved earlier, so that when they go to college, they're just like, oh, okay, I can see myself in a science role. I want to get a PhD in chemistry, or I want to get a PhD, I want to go to medical school and work to cure cancer. So I think that kind of stuff is important, is making that investment early that may not be an immediate payoff in getting a hire, but that leads to a bigger talent pool down the road of people that the company can hire.
Yeah, these long-term permanent commitments have to be made in order for that change to eventually take effect, 10, 15, 20 years from now. So I appreciate that point. I try to let the panelists know about questions I'm going to ask ahead of time. So not to throw like a little bit of a wrench into it, Jonathan and Chris, but I said I was going to ask you both a question. The thing about EA is that EA is a brand that is a household name. Everybody knows they create video games, but I imagine over the decades that they've been in existence that there's been shifts that have happened internally. People love their products, but there's also the fact that they've probably been making some pivots in terms of how they approach hiring. Chris, I'm just curious about anything that you've noticed, which is going to end up being a different question for Jonathan since Chime hasn't been around that long. But Chris, any thoughts from you on that?
Yeah. I think when it comes to the actual hiring practices, it's not something that I've been too closely involved with myself. I think one thing that Jason did touch on, however, is the building of a company to attract diverse talent, organically. And I think to bring it back around to the employee resource groups, I feel like that's the main thing that I'm involved with, that I feel like is working to build that space for diverse talent. And I think without having strong employee resource group initiatives, and without making sure the employees that are dedicating their time and resources to putting on those events, putting on, you know, these different activities with the ERGs, without the company needs to get behind those employees and provide them with, you know, the compensation if able, or at least the space needed in their normal day-to-day jobs to be able to work on building those ERGs. I think that could be a key way to organically attract diverse talent.
Yeah, it's actually such an important point that you brought up, that the ERG piece. I actually was interviewing somebody earlier today. I've interviewed a series of people this week, and each time at the end of the interview, and if these candidates were diverse, they had some sort of you know, diverse identity element to them. I said, ask me anything. Ask me anything. I've been at this company for a long time. And they consistently were asking about the ERGs. Like that was the end question that they had a curiosity around. They're like, I feel more comfortable applying to this company because I see you're making a commitment to this. So like, there's so much truth to that. It's a really important point.
Yeah, I'd love to add a little bit to that as well. So there are so many things that may come off as silent bias too. So outside of just the, you know, the outreach side of things, look at your job descriptions, look at how you're wording things. And if it's presenting any sort of language that may be exclusionary, there are some great like kind of resume building and then also just like JD building tools that are out there now that will actually tell you if you're using inherently biased language. So now we have technology to kind of help us along this journey for those that may not, you know, kind of understand out of the gate, like this terminology or asking for this set of requirements that might be unattainable for a large segment of the community and in diverse communities as well. Is that really like necessary for this job position, or can we really take a step back and look at that? I think another thing I've done as a hiring manager is when like that pool of diverse candidates is not available, you start looking towards the candidate pool that is available. Are they allies? Have they been involved with ERGs in the past? Are they going to uplift and promote other members of these different diverse communities and help with future talent that may come on board, making them feel welcome and like it's a great place to be. So there are a ton of alternative things you can do as well to just help with that, even if it's not immediately accessible to the organization.
Love that point too. Thanks for bringing that up, Jonathan. It is something, one of those more subtle things that is just sometimes lost on people, is that we need to make these modifications to make people feel welcome. And I think that's a thread that's come across the course of the conversation that we've had today, that it's really in the details, that a lot of these messages, we're sending silent messages to people about whether or not we're going to be accepting of them. So.
Yeah, and one thing I wanted to add on that as well in terms of the ERG, two cool things that, or one cool thing, one not great thing that I've experienced personally is being offered during the interview process. Like as I was interviewing in certain cases, there'd be an optional additional interview where you could meet with a head of some of the, either the diversity and inclusion groups or the ERGs, not for them to grade you specifically, but more for you as a candidate to talk to them and ask them those questions about like, hey, what are you doing? You know, how are things in terms of ERG development? Is it a really solid group? Because I've also been part of experiences where, you know, companies tout this amazing ERG group experience and they list out all of their ERGs that support different groups. So it gets you excited. But then when you join the organization, you find that these groups are underfunded. So they have no actual funding to help create events, spread awareness, you know, kind of help. Or the groups are empty. There hasn't been any nurturing put into the ERG space. So you have like, you know, on paper, we have ERGs, but then when you actually enter into the organization, it's like a ghost town in a lot of these ERGs that were set up. So I think it's really important to bring in leaders like Jason into organizations where it's like, hey, this isn't just everybody who has free time after they do their day-to-day, you know, role and responsibility to help foster this environment. Hire somebody dedicated to that can lead that and to really build it out, find out the problem areas and really just make sure that those groups continue to grow. So your organization doesn't look like they were just like talking all this stuff and didn't actually hold true to that promise when you join, because that will also lead to retention issues and people will notice and they will leave if they get that sense of, you know, genuinity. I can't even words.
Yeah. I mean, I completely agreed with you. When it comes across disingenuous, it has the opposite effect. And I think, unfortunately, like even everything that you were just describing now, Jonathan, it makes me think that sometimes ERGs, they're secretly presented like an extracurricular after school activity, you know, based on the way that you just set it up, and that underfunding and or that negligence, that lack of support, not having a Jason there to support and make sure that those groups have that visibility and can be propped up to be successful. It has the opposite effect. It's like it's not a set it and forget it. So I think that stems, it takes us in the direction of another question, which frankly, I probably should have asked earlier, which is just getting the definition of what an ERG or BRG is, because we've been using the acronym nonstop. I think that's fortunately just current life. You just start using an acronym without sharing exactly what it stands for. But maybe it would be fair to toss it back to Jason to just give us the high level on what are ERGs.
Yeah, so for me, ERGs, and ERG stands for Employee Resource Group. And when you really think about what they are, they're employee-led organizations, typically revolving around some sort of identity. And that identity could be anything from race or ethnicity or gender or veteran status or parental status. It could be any number of things, any number of identities that exist out there. And those groups are typically formed as a support group. It could be as a safe space. It could be as an active group that's trying to make changes within an organization. But I think the key part of it is that it's employee-led. I think some companies try to force ERGs to happen because that's the hot thing that everybody's doing. So they're trying to force it. If the employees aren't motivated to make this happen, it's never going to be successful. And that means that the companies have to be supportive, and that one of the things that John and I worked for one company together, and there were issues where sometimes managers gave people who joined employee resource groups and were in the steering committees and things like that, gave them problems for spending too much company time on employee resource groups. And so that made those people less likely to want to volunteer to be part of the steering committee, part of the leadership of a group, because they felt that it threatened their position. And that's the most detrimental thing that can happen to a company for ERGs, because if people don't feel like they can be a part of it and contribute, they won't do it.
Yeah, and recognizing and celebrating as a manager, as a people manager, if your teams are taking extra time out of their day, they're balancing their workload and they're also doing ERG involvement or community service, yes, or anything that is helping to give back for both the internal employees and just the larger world, that should be celebrated. And something I've started doing specifically is we all have the review times during the year, right? And then, a lot of companies, they do bonuses and they do merit-based increases. I factor ERG involvement into that. I say you're not mandated as your manager, you're not mandated to do this stuff, but I will tell you, it is going to impact how much of a bonus you potentially get versus your peers. Because if everybody's doing great work, but then you have somebody who's also participating in ERGs, leading events, just learning and becoming a better human being, I want to reward them for that, because ultimately it is going to make the organization a better place. So I encourage all the managers out there, start thinking about that and encouraging your employees and really giving them space, making that space for them in certain cases for them to get more actively involved, because that's going to keep them around longer. That's going to make them overall happy. And it's going to show to them that you care, you care and you care about them. And I think it's just a great thing to do overall.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, I think. Sorry. Go ahead, Chris. Jump in.
Just to add that I think one of the other great things with the ERGs is that, they can also help amplify the voices of those employees that may be part of these marginalized communities and may not always have as strong of a voice with some of the company's leadership when it comes to things like benefits. Some communities may have unique benefits that some of their needs might not be met because they don't have as strong of a voice in the room when those types of benefits are being decided on. So that's one way that an ERG can also function within the organization.
It's another great point, and especially if you're still early in your hiring days as far as trying to bring that diversity. So there are going to be employees that there's no strength in numbers, and speaking up is going to be exceptionally more challenging as a result of that. So it's a great point to note. I think another layer here is that we've really been talking about the employee experience, something that's happening inside for the brand itself. But the thing is, you all work for brands that are public facing, and some of those brands in particular, like Chris and Jonathan, those are household names. I know EA, I've known EA forever. And even though Chime hasn't been around as long, I'm very familiar with all their commercials and with their products. So let's talk about the customer experience and some of the products that are being developed. I'm curious about how ERGs can help support brands themselves doing good for the audiences that they are serving. And Chris, I'll throw that question to you.
Yeah, sure. So to give more of a concrete example of that within EA, one of the titles at EA is The Sims, and it is basically a game about living a simulated life. And for many of the Sims players, there's been a desire to include the option to designate your Sims with non-gendered pronouns, as those players may do in their own lives. And I think EA has recently announced that the Maxis team has been working on including this feature for a while now, but there has been some challenges with doing something like this because it's important to make sure that the way that one character in the game is addressing a character that uses these non-gendered pronouns, it's important to make sure that it's being done in the correct and respectful way. And then not only that, but how is that then done in 20 plus different languages? And those types of challenges, it's really important for members of those communities to offer guidance in how to do that. And one way that EA has been able to get that guidance is through our ERGs. Our Pride ERG, which is the LGBTQ employee resource group, has been there to assist these teams with guidance on how to make sure that the product that's being developed will authentically meet our players' needs and the expectations.
Thanks for sharing that example, Chris. Jonathan, I'm curious if you have an example that you want to share before. I know we're running low on time, and we're going to pivot into questions briefly. We don't have a massive group attending in real time, so I feel like we can bleed over a little bit. Carrie, let me know if I'm right about that. But Jonathan, I'd be curious for any perspective from if Chime has done anything similar.
I love hearing stories about like what Chris just talked about, and then actual ERGs influencing products that are being built out. Because you have different companies that have the ability to represent a lot of these groups in different ways. Sometimes you're a CPG company and it's a little bit more difficult to figure out, like, how do we represent this? It kind of goes into the advertising sector, right? Like, how do we make sure these groups are being represented in there? Well, when there is the ability to kind of change the product to be more inclusive, I always love those moments. So at Chime, a recent example that was really great to hear was the Outchimers, which is our Pride-based group as well, LGBTQ plus group. They actually helped influence a feature of the in-app experience for our members where they could use their preferred name. So there was something that they advocated for, they really fought for. They took it upstairs, they talked to leadership, they put together a proposal, and it wound up being enabled within the app that users could put their preferred name. And it's the little things like that that make people going through those transitionary periods just feel just so much more normalized to be able to use things like their preferred name in things like banking apps. So that's a recent example of something I could think of that was really great work that came out one of our internal ERGs.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that as well, Jonathan. I'm going to quickly actually throw it back to Chris, because I think the thing is oftentimes when we do these narrations, we think of a cycle of, well, the ERG can inform the brand, and then the company can change the product, and then who's the beneficiary? It is the consumer, but it actually can work the other way. Chris, did you have an example of when it worked the other way?
Sure, yeah, and I have to do my best to keep this vague so I don't get into any trouble, but I think without going into too much detail, there can be cases where decisions are being made based on the product we're delivering, and those decisions can affect specific communities. And in order to best make those decisions, I know this might sound a little bit like common sense, but it's always best to have people from those communities being a part of those discussions. And in some cases, you might not have those communities within the company, or even in the room when those decisions are being made. So it's important to make sure that there is a representative, someone from that community, to help make those decisions. And if you don't have that within the company, I think it's also a good point for you to start looking more into those, the strategies that you're using with hiring and making sure that you are hiring diverse employees.
Yeah, well, thank you for that point, Chris. And I know it's a little bit vague. I'll be honest, like there's a really good story behind it. And I just want to say that the overarching narrative is that it is really important to talk to those folks if they do not work at your company, but you are serving those communities. And I would really take that point away, because you can feel really strong within a regionalized group, but then the reality is you don't have the experiences of everyone else. We all have more to learn. And we should always be open to it. And I think that's what we really tried to hone in on today for the session. So I want to thank everyone, Chris, Jonathan, and Jason, for making yourselves available. And it's been a pleasure doing this panel with you all.